Okay. Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with grand rounds today. Dr. Kuroga. Hello, everybody. Today's my great pleasure to introduce our grand round speaker, Dr. Raymond Jean. As many of you know, we have multiple career development initiatives at the department, and one of them is the University of Michigan Exchange, when we send one faculty to the University of Michigan, and we get one back. And this year we got to enjoy the really benefits of that as we are welcoming back some of our past graduated from the trauma fellowship. Ray completed his fellowship on trauma and surgical care here at the University of Washington at the Harborview Medical Center before joining the Division of Acute Care Surgery at Michigan. And his path to surgery began actually years ago at Harvard, where he earned an AB in engineering. He went to WashU for medical school, and when he was there, just because he also picked up a master's in outcomes research. And then he went to general surgery at Yale, and he did research in his time there at the National Clinician Scholar Programs. After residency and joining us, he went to Michigan. He's now the medical director of the Trauma Burn Intensive Care Unit. And as a health service research, Ray studied how everyday data sources can use to predict the risk of severe injury after motor vehicle crashes. He's a core faculty at the Michigan Center for Healthcare Outcomes and Policy, and he already has extramural funding for his work. Most notable, he's the inaugural recipient of the Henry Ford Junior Faculty Research Grant from the Association of Academic Surgery Foundation. So please join me in welcoming Ray. Thank you for coming all the way here.
Right, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and I'm really happy to be back. So today I'll be talking about how we can use artificial intelligence to improve field triage after motor vehicle crashes. And some of this will just be kind of my background. So in terms of disclosures, like I was mentioned, at the University of Michigan, I'm the assistant medical director for the International Center for Automotive Medicine. And as part of that, we get support from General Motors, Subaru, and Toyota. And also as part of that, I'm the assistant director of our fellowship, which I'll talk about in the talk, which is funded by GM. And then the research funding, like Dr. Quiroga had mentioned, I did receive research funding from the Association for Academic Surgery Foundation. So I think I'll start by saying, who am I? These are kind of the standard pictures that they take of the new Michigan faculty. And I'm a acute care surgeon and clinical outcomes researcher. I developed my baseline kind of interest in clinical research was always around the idea that there's so much data that kind of exists around us at all times. And not much of that is actually used to actively make decisions in healthcare. So if I were to put an overarching goal in terms of my clinical perspective and what I hope to achieve in research, it's being able to use the data that's all around us to make decisions on trauma and surgical care. I received my undergraduate degree in engineering, and I did a secondary field in economics and econometrics at Harvard. And this is only relevant because a lot of my interest in doing academic research was my ability to leverage kind of the mathematical and statistical skills I had gained through my undergraduate engineering training. And then I went to medical school at Washington University in St. Louis, where as part of that, I did a 5-year program with the Doris Duke Clinical Scholars. Again, this was the one paper I published during that time as a medical student, and it was in head and neck cancer. Back then you could just look at a database and it would get published in the one of the major society journals. So it was really in preparing this paper and that I developed a love for clinical research. Also, as Dr. Quiroga mentioned, I was a general surgery resident at Yale and then was in the first cohort of the Yale National Clinician Scholars Program. This was the kind of follow-up for the Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholars Program that started, I want to believe here, I believe in the years we're rushing. I know they had a major site, certainly at the Robert Wood Johnson Program. This is the Clinician Scholars Program website as of May 5th, 2026. That was me almost 10 years ago now, and they're still using that picture, which is, just goes to show they're getting their benefit out of my training. And it was really during this time that I developed an interest in machine learning and surgical outcomes. I was fortunate enough to work for the Center for Outcomes Research and Evaluation Core at Yale, and we published two projects looking at the electronic data record and using machine learning algorithms to see how we can make that data that normally is collected for documentation or for record keeping useful in terms of predicting diagnoses or predicting major mortality after cardiac surgery. So I want to give kind of relevant to the talk, just a brief primer on what is machine learning and kind of at least centralized machine learning and artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence can be thought of as kind of really an umbrella term. It refers to any computer system that's designed to mimic human intelligence in terms of patterns and to perform tasks. You can imagine the simplest artificial intelligence machine is what's called a reactive machine. This is a algorithm or machine that performs actions or responses based on a predetermined set of rules that doesn't actually have any context or memory. One example that we all kind of see in day-to-day living is really spam filters. These spam filters detect certain words, detect certain email addresses, and then automatically filter something as spam or not. These don't tend to be very kind of fancy. They tend to have high error rates, but you can think of this as kind of the most basic form. On the other end is the probably most extreme form of artificial intelligence, which is that of artificial general intelligence. This is a theoretical, possibly in existence, we don't know, but AI system that can understand, learn, and apply knowledge to the level that a human being can. Most computer science engineers would say that we have not achieved artificial general intelligence yet. Many would say we're certainly within the next 5 to 10 years close to it. And then you can really think of machine learning, artificial intelligence as nested terms. So like we discussed, artificial intelligence is an overarching umbrella term that refers to any system that can perform or mimic human tasks. Machine learning, therefore, is a subset of artificial intelligence that uses algorithms to recognize patterns in data and then can automatically self-improve and improve its own algorithmic specificity or improve its accuracy based on training and learning that it does from that data. And lastly, deep learning, which is a little bit outside the perspective of this talk, is a subset of machine learning that uses neural networks that perform complex tasks, oftentimes with unstructured data. So lastly, you can think of really just some terms that are often used in machine learning just for context, the concept of supervised versus unsupervised learning. This refers to training models on data that have correct answer that have been labeled by usually outside sources. So oftentimes supervised learning is when you provide a algorithm with a data source, you have labeled the correct versus incorrect answers, and then eventually learns how to label something as correct or incorrect. Unsupervised would be that you don't provide it with that a priori data, and it ultimately through trial and error is able to figure out the labels on its own. Large language models, this is probably how AI has interacted with most of us on the day-to-day. And this is natural language processing models that interpret words within context and then can form human-like speech answers based on that context. So this is your ChatGPT, your Llama, your Claude, things like that. And then lastly, transformer models. It can't be really understated how impactful transformer models have been in the popularization of AI that we see in day-to-day. A transformer is essentially a model that allows for the interpretation of input within context. So if you think of that initial example I brought up of the reactive machine, it really just has a set amount of words. So if you feed it a sentence, it reads that sentence word for word. And oftentimes, if you feed it 4 sentences, it really forgets the first sentence by the time it got to the 4th one. A transformer model was novel in that it allows you to not only take that initial sentence and break it up into things called tokens, but then it allows a specific point to contextualize those tokens within each other. So you have suddenly gained the concept of attention, and you can contextualize your inputs to the other inputs around them, which allowed for not only improved memory, but also allows for conventional responses that sound more human-like. So all of this is really just a prediction and predicting the next word. However, when you can account for context, it allows that prediction to usually be more accurate. So you can think of really machine learning, which is kind of the context of this talk and most of the work that I've done, to consist of really three steps, which are the input layer, as in this case, these are radiographic images, input them into a model, it extracts features, which are really just inputs. You can think of them as the independent variables of some type of model. And that goes into what's called the IL or input layer. And then there's a single hidden layer, which is where all the connections are formed, predictions are made, and that goes to the output layer, which is the green dots. Deep learning, which a little bit outside the context of this talk, but this is really what you see in kind of the higher end kind of commercial artificial intelligence models, feature model, foundation models that we see in day to day. They have multiple hidden layers where the inputs are broken down into tokens. Those tokens are contextualized within each other. And then through those multiple hidden layers, they end up forming connections that allow for an output layer. So this was a brief crash course on AI, but that really was contextualized into how I became interested in this field was through research. So then lastly, in the kind of last of my clinical training, I came to do my trauma fellowship at Harborview Medical Center, which, you can't have a talk about Harborview Medical Center in Seattle without showing beautiful Mount Rainier, which we would pass by every day on rounds. And then this is myself and my co-fellow, Dr. Biscard, who's currently a trauma attending here. I think I might be kind of on my tippy toes on this picture, just so I looked I looked taller because she's actually much taller than me. And then the beautiful Seattle sunsets over the water that we would take every night when we were on call. Can't be a trauma fellowship without taking your helicopter photo on the rooftop. And then I'm pretty sure we tricked Dr. Arbabi into jumping by himself on this photo. So that was an entertaining time as well. And then lastly, you can see actually I'm very much shorter than all the other co-fellows. But, I can't understate how foundational my time at Harborview was to my future career and just my training in general as a trauma surgeon. But everyone has to leave a nest eventually. And after completing my fellowship in trauma at Harborview, I transitioned to what Dr. Rababi calls the Harborview East, which is the University of Michigan. Several of our graduates tend to become faculty there, and everyone's doing really well. And it was really after I got to the University of Michigan that I became involved in the International Center for Automotive Medicine. And then I think kind of a lesson to all the current residents and trainees is I generally did not have an interest in car crashes or automotive, that aspect of trauma care before I had gone to the University of Michigan. But University of Michigan, it's in Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor is about 50 miles from Detroit. And you really can't move to Detroit or anywhere in the Detroit proximity without getting involved in cars. Obviously, car culture is very important there. And opportunity to join the International Center of Automotive Medicine just kind of showed up. One of my partners, Stuart Wang, he founded the institute probably, certainly over 10 or 15 years ago. And his goal was really to convene a multidisciplinary group to provide clinical perspective to automotive crashes and to try to reduce the morbidity and mortality after car crashes. He would, especially after I came on, we started to link the data that we had through our relationships with the automotive industry to Michigan Trauma Quality Improvement Program data, which was created by one of my colleagues, Mark Hemela. So we created a pretty robust system where the International Center for Automotive Medicine would collect data and through partnerships with the automotive companies, do crash case reviews. And we also had this, the Automotive Engineer Fellowship, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So the crash case reviews, I think, are really important. So I'll take a second to talk about that and its relevance, particularly to the research they do and the data. So during these crash reviews, essentially the International Center of Automotive Medicine, or ICAM as we called it, would obtain publicly available police reports, and we would transfer those into a large database. So every car crash within the state of Michigan that causes either some injury, so really any level of injury, or greater than $1,000 worth of damage and occurred on a public road, requires a police report to be written by the Michigan state troopers. Those police reports are all publicly available, and theoretically, under Freedom of Information Act, you could request them. We establish relationships with the Michigan State Police Department to where we automatically got them without too much legal trouble for the purposes of doing retrospective review and trying to improve the quality improvement in how we treat and how cars are designed. So then after collating all those crashes, we do an analytic review and then we bring everyone together. So we will sit in an auditorium similar to this, and we will have several representatives from multiple car companies, not just kind of a single vendor. And this includes safety engineers, this includes product engineers. We have members from the representatives from the Michigan State Police who can talk just about in terms of the actual legal aspect of whether or not a car was driving too fast on the road, whether or not there's dash cam footage, whether or not they have pictures of the crash on the scene. And we have representatives from emergency medical services too, the paramedics who respond to these crashes, who do the initial workup of the patients. And then we all have trauma surgeons such as myself, Dr. Hemela, Dr. Wang. And then when we have data scientists as well. So we bring all these people together in a room and we go over kind of the relevant cases. And this can be any case in which there was a mortality and in which there was a severe injury. And we talk really from start to finish about recreate the events that led to the crash. And this can go to the level of, was the car driving in an eastward direction during the early in the morning? And was the sun blocking the vision of the person driving the car? Was the stoplight that should have been there out of commission, and therefore people who should have been stopped weren't recognizing or weren't able to stop? And sometimes this can even go to the level of, is the height of the curb too high such that even though there's a bicycle there oftentimes going down that road, the cars that have to try to stop just aren't seeing them. So we go through all these granular details. The trauma surgeons will talk about the trauma care, the things that we look for in terms of when patients are coming in, are they critically or not critically ill, and things that can be done in the field to try to reduce mortality. And then after each crash, we kind of form a summary and a review, and all of this gets collected in a data set, and all of these generate reports for the auto companies. So you can imagine that this kind of framework, this system actually leads to a lot of quality improvement and allows for, it's valuable to the car companies because they want to design safe vehicles, but they actually don't see any of the downstream impacts of things they design. It's relevant for us, the trauma surgeons, because we see certain injury patterns and we don't know what goes into it necessarily on the vehicle control side. And overall, it's beneficial to have kind of the central repository of information, but kind of most relevant for me, it allows us to collect a lot of data. So we can get really granular data from the vehicle, from the auto companies, really granular data from the scene, from our case reviews. And then lastly, the other major thing that we do at the International of Medicine is that of the injury fellowship. So at ICAM, we have every year we take between 4 to 6 automotive engineers, and these are all generally mechanical engineers, no medical training whatsoever. And we do kind of like a mini medical school fellowship for them. So every week we have courses where we teach them anatomy. We obtain a cadaver and actually do an anatomy lab with them to show them internal organs, muscular structure, bone structure. And alongside it, they also get education in kind of how crash investigators investigate car crashes. They go out to, I think we have a kind of a model car in the field where they can do a mock extrication to see actually how difficult it is to get injured occupants out of vehicles. And it's they always say it's kind of a very educational opportunity for them because they're sitting designing these vehicles, designing these safety measures, but really don't see the downstream ramifications of what they do. So I think through this kind of multidisciplinary collaboration, we tend to build a level of familiarity and a level of understanding that people can have across multiple fields. So I think ultimately the question becomes, how is this all relevant and what is the problem we're trying to solve? So all of us kind of know motor vehicle crashes are a major problem in the United States. I think I can't imagine everyone who has not either been in a motor vehicle crash yourself or does not know someone who's been in a major motor vehicle crash. But it results in over 3 million emergency departments visits and over 40,000 deaths annually. And I think oftentimes for medical epidemiology, we talk about how many deaths there are within for certain disease processes. But for context, if you imagine that there were, say, one regional airliner that were to have a crash, make national news, it would be a kind of considered an actual tragedy. If you had one regional airliner crash pretty much every day for an entire year, that would just under approximate essentially how many patients die in car crashes. So this is a major problem, and it's something that I think we sometimes take as understate the reality of how much opportunity there is to improve. Under triage after motor vehicle crash is a major problem, and rates of under triage kind of vary in the field, vary kind of in the literature. Some people say it's up to 60% in certain populations. And then for the non-trauma surgeons, under triage is really this concept that a patient is in a car crash, just as a case example, and they have injuries that are not immediately detected. So this can manifest in terms of someone having an injury that's not detected. They're brought to a level 2, level 3 trauma center or not a trauma center at all. And they miss that, what we call in trauma, the golden hour during which you can intervene on someone's injuries to dramatically reduce mortality. So when patients are not adequately worked up, when those injuries go unrecognized, it does lead to the risk that they are under triage, and that it really generally increases their risk of mortality after crashes. And we see this very commonly in older adults and then patient in rural areas as well, particularly in rural areas simply because access to hospitals is further away. In a city, if you're in a car crash, everyone can get on their phone and call. In rural areas, this doesn't happen as much simply because the crashes might happen away from anyone who sees them. And improving field triage is very much been a priority for the American College of Surgeons and the Committee on Trauma in terms of improving trauma care globally. And so much so that the National Trauma Research Action Plan was formed and to guide kind of future trauma research. And field triage was identified as a very high priority pre-hospital issue. So this was a publication in the Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery, which was looking at as I mentioned, the National Trauma Research Action Plan, forming a Delphi consensus about the most important issues in trauma care that should be studied, and highlighted field triage made up really 3 of the top 10. I highlighted really the top 2 of the top 8 issues that we face in the day-to-day. Now, Dr. Bulger obviously is on this paper, and Dr. Bulger contributed extensively to a lot of the work I do. And we kind of address this through creating the Committee on Trauma, through creating national guidelines on field triage for injured patients. And this is broken down into red criteria and yellow criteria. The red criteria, the high risk, severe criteria, are things that we learn in kind of day-to-day trauma care and surgical care. So injury patterns, patients who have obvious penetrating injuries, skull deformities, spinal injury, things that to any of us probably would be obvious that a patient's very high risk. But then there's also kind of patient assessment things in terms of mental status and vital signs. And this includes patients who have an altered GCS, patients who have decreased or increased respiratory rate, or alterations of blood pressure based on age. One part that I want to highlight are really the yellow criteria, which are kind of the moderate risk things that heighten attention, but in themselves could be indicative of severe injury. And the Committee on Trauma for the guidelines did include some aspect of the vehicular telemetry data consistent with severe injury. And secondly, they included a focus on EMS provider judgment. So this is, I think, where a lot of the interest in terms of improving field triage can lie, because if we had a full picture of kind of a patient's clinical status and they manifested their vital signs perfectly, then it'd be very rare for people to be under triaged. And yet there's opportunity because we depend a lot on our first responders to detect injuries. And we have opportunity to use vehicular telemetry. So I'll talk what is vehicular telemetry. So as anyone who's gotten a new car knows, or anyone who's seen a car in probably the last 5 to 10 years, all of modern vehicles have dozens of sensors that collect data. This is how your car knows that you're too close to the car in front of you. This is how your car knows that how fast you're going, and then when you have a sudden impact, it knows to release your airbag. These data points really track your vehicle in space and time, and you could imagine that they form kind of an in vehicular model of what's actually happening in the physics of your car. And most vehicles, as I think many of you have seen, if you're in a severe enough crash, they can reach out to you and ask you, would you like to call for help? These systems that are reaching out and calling for help are called AACNs, or Advanced Automatic Crash Notification Systems. This is really one of the greatest opportunities we have in injury prevention with motor vehicles to try to improve the ability for us to contact emergency providers, contact EMS to get patients seen faster. So these are onboard crash notification systems that communicate with EMS in the event that there is a severe enough car crash. The systems do monitor vehicular telemetry and can activate if there's a anticipated force that's concerning enough that a patient's at high risk for injury. Nearly all modern vehicles, certainly all those created probably within the past 10 years, have some option of an AACN. Most of the times how we see them on the client side is through subscriptions. So the one that probably is most famous, and I think I remember the longest when I was a kid, because you see commercials on them, is GM's OnStar. So you have this system that detects you're in a crash. Some very soft voice comes in and says, OnStar is here. Do you need help? Can we contact 911 for you? This is an incredible technology that was developed, but has not been fully actuated, I think, in terms of the safety that it can provide. And part of that is because it's under subscription, so not everyone has it activated automatically. So one of the questions we had was at the International Center for Autonomous Medicine, because we have all this data and because we work with the auto companies, can we actually show some benefit to AACNs? So we were able to do a kind of smallest study on a sample of vehicles, 300 of them which had AACNs and 1,200 which did not have AACNs. And we compared transport times among the vehicles that had the AACNs versus those that didn't. We had some baselines in terms of all the vehicles had to be after 2014, just so you were comparing somewhat apples to apples. You weren't comparing a car from 1965 to obviously one in 2020. And all the crashes had to involve a airbag deployment, just so we had some baseline severity. And through our connections with GM, we were able to verify that the vehicles did not, the ones that were labeled as not having ACN definitely did not have active AACN subscriptions. What we found is that the drivers who had AACNs activated tended to be younger, tended to be female. They tended to be newer cars, as in cars that were later model years than the non-AACNs. And interestingly enough, vehicles that tend to be in car crashes tend to occur in more often urban areas and more often closer to a hospital. So if you imagine the response that EMS gets when you're in a car crash, so the first step is really you're in a motor vehicle crash. At some point, somebody, be that your ACN, someone in the car, someone who's a bystander, contacts 911 EMS, and EMS is dispatched to your vehicle. And the next step, that EMS dispatch, let's see if I can use the laser pointer. So EMS is dispatched, and then after some time, depending on how far you are when you crash, EMS arrives and you're evaluated. The time between EMS arrival and EMS departure varies on the injuries you have, but ideally in a severely injured patient, you would minimize this time and departure and get them to an emergency department as quickly as possible. So from our data that we had connected with at ICAM, because we had data from the vehicle through our connection with the automotive companies, and we had data on the hospital and from emergency services from our connection with the Michigan 12-month Quality Improvement Program, we actually had timestamps of every point of this process. So what did we find? Well, so here is a bar graph. Again, this is all preliminary data that we're submitting now, but a bar graph of the transport times between the AACN and non-AACN vehicles. The non-AACNs are in dark blue and the AACNs are in light blue. And I apologize, it looks like there's one of the times is missing here, but in actuality, what we see is pretty much at every step of the process, the AACN vehicles had shorter transport times than the non-AACN vehicles. Probably what's most interesting is when we separated this among rural versus urban motor vehicle crashes. The rural or motor vehicle crashes were smaller in number. It was about a sample size of, I think, around 300 total, which broke down to about 60 AACN and 240 non-AACN. But that's actually where we saw the most dramatic difference in transport times. And I want to highlight, because the sample sizes were low, the only statistically significant difference were really in the first two steps, in the time from crash to EMS dispatch and then crash to EMS arrival. The point estimates for all these were lower, but they were not statistically significant just because there was so much variation. In comparison to the urban setting, you can see that the AACN vehicles were still mostly lower. However, these differences were much smaller, and they often were on the scale of a minute or less. But if you looked at the total transport time overall, you saw almost a 7 to 8 minute difference in the rural patterns, whereas in the urban, you see maybe a 1 minute difference. So this data was really encouraging because it told us that there probably is opportunity to improve the field triage improve the degree to which EMS responders can arrive at the scene, can assess patients and move them quickly to trauma centers through the use of data that's within the vehicle. We were starting from this work that my predecessor, Dr. Wang, had done, where he had developed a system, the injury severity predictor, that would calculate a risk of someone's injury after car crashes based on the data within the vehicle and then some components of the patient. So this was generated by the data scientists at the University of Michigan, and it's one of many risk scoring systems in field triage. We had one at University of Washington as well. But they collected data from the National Automotive Sampling System, which is created by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which collected thousands of car crashes and assembled a large database that's publicly available. And they want to calculate the risk that a occupant had an injury, ISS greater than 15 injury. ISS, for non-trauma surgeons, is an injury severity score. It's a composite score made up of the most severe injuries that a patient has when they're presenting for a trauma that are detected over the course of their hospital stay. So if you could identify the patients who are at high risk for severe injuries, you could use that information to expedite transfer to trauma centers. Through their analysis, they found primarily 6 components. The first being the delta V, which is the change in velocity over the time of the crash. Primary direction of force, you can consider this really the crash angle, or kind of angle at which the vehicle is struck, or the forces are applied. Occupant age greater than 55, the presence of a female occupant, presence of a right-sided passenger, seatbelt use, and then the vehicle type, either a large vehicle or a smaller vehicle. And over the course, what they found was the most significant predictor of severe injury was this delta V. So it probably makes intuitive sense to all of us that if you are going faster in a vehicle and you crash, the change in velocity is probably the most significant predictor for how high risk it is that an occupant is injured. And this followed by the primary direction of force, whether it's a frontal collision versus a side collision. And a lot of this matters in terms of where the safety measures that are present in the vehicle actually live and exist. And this was another figure from the original paper demonstrating that the direction of force matters as well. So you can imagine this is from 0 to 360 degrees. If 0 is the front of the vehicle, 360 degrees wraps you around to the front again. You see spikes in terms of the impact, the odds of injury based on directionality that occur whether someone struck on the you can see they really, the greatest risks are if you're struck directly on either side, so if you're T-bone essentially. And there's somewhat of a risk if you're struck on the vehicle's right side, much, much higher risk if you're struck on the left side. However, if you have two passengers in the vehicle, as in the driver and then someone on the right side of the vehicle, that risk once you're struck on the right side increases dramatically to that someone in the vehicle is injured. So the question goes, how does this translate to machine learning, and how did we get from a lot of what's been done and the initial work we've done to kind of my interest and my research my field of study? So as we know, cars are becoming increasingly complex computational systems. A lot of the data that has been collected for decades is only getting more and more complex. Our ability to capture more and more data through onboard computers, through uploading to the cloud is increasing. And historically, and as when the University of Michigan developed this injury severity predictor, we had condensed all of this data into point estimates. So we could calculate a delta V longitudinal, delta V latitudinal, the XY components of your velocity, and it was just a number. And using that number generated a logistic regression that can predict your injury. But you can imagine that there's probably more information than there's really just the collapse of those numbers. So this really translates. So like we know, modern vehicles have computers and AACN systems, and we're trying to reduce field triage. So when you're in a crash, what's essentially being captured on your vehicle's computer is a deflection in your delta V over some period of time, and that deflection in delta V goes back to 0. So say I'm traveling at 35 miles an hour because I am following the rules, and I hit a tree. There will be a dramatic negative increase in that velocity over time, and then eventually my vehicle will come to a stop, and that change in velocity will go back to 0. That deflection is essentially equivalent to an acceleration, which, based on the mass of the car, is a force. These waveforms, this is the most simplest example is when I hit like a wall or a tree. But imagine if what's practically happening is I swerve, I hit one car, I bounce and hit another car. So this deflection actually becomes incredibly complicated. And what AI and machine learning could provide is allows for a more complex input of the data that doesn't just collapse into a single point estimate. So you can imagine through dozens or hundreds of vehicles, this actually ends up looking like large deflections, which are complex waveforms that then can get classified into red or blue. Some vehicles have a waveform deflection that turns into a severe crash with patients who have an ISS 15 injury. Some turn into non-severe crashes that have low ISS injuries. And we wanted to study this using machine learning and AI. So with collaborators I have in the School of Engineering, we took some of that national data through the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's crash investigation sampling system. And this gave us around 10,000 cases where we use something called a transformer-based model. As I explained earlier, transformers are useful because they allow you to apply particular attention to certain data within context of the data around them. So we had one model where we took a kind of standard regression tree machine learning model with static variables. And this included the vehicle type, things that we knew about the occupant's age, occupant sex, BMI, safe boat use, whatever data we could collect. And then we introduce the waveform data into a transformer model that then added upon that static model that we had. And this is a mock-up from a grant that we wrote, but the idea is that you take the occupant static data, input it with a transformer, you develop multiple layers and then generate an output. So our initial study, we did the kind of simplest case example we could think of, which was that single frontal crash. And we were able to generate a model that demonstrated very effective accuracy in terms of predicting severe injury with an AUC of 0.95. And our ultimate goal is to develop a pattern where we can not only just show feature importance, as in which things are important relative to others, but actually this is what's called a SHAP values, which show not only a variable's importance, but also it is allowed to be discordantly important. So something can be both important in the positive direction when it's positive, but significantly important in the negative direction. It doesn't have to be a linear association that we would see in a traditional logistic regression model. So all of this put together allows us to develop a pre-train a model, and this can either be deployed to the cloud or deployed even directly on the vehicles once the model is trained, such that when someone is in a crash, that model takes the direct data from the vehicle, predicts the risk of severe injury, and then through the AACN can activate emergency services, get people transported to places where they need to be. We're still in the initial phase of this. Obviously, this is probably a lifetime of work, but one fascinating thing that has been true is that being at the University of Michigan, being at the International Center for Automotive Medicine, is really the perfect format not only to study this, develop the initial machine learning algorithms, but also work with implementation. I don't have to go out and find EMS providers and develop relationships. We already bring them into our case reviews. We have trauma surgeons there. We have automotive engineers there. We have first responders there. So everyone can comment on the research we're doing and our desired goals, and ultimately contribute. And hopefully we can develop an implementation plan over some period of time. So there are many limitations to this that I think are important to address. First, like I had mentioned, the integration really depends on having at least new enough vehicles in the field. This would be incredibly challenging to do. There's a large population of people who really don't want to give up on their 75 pickup. This would be incredibly challenging to do with older vehicles, and we cannot integrate it overnight to really change the trauma system. There are differences in automakers, and one of the fascinating things I'm learning is that even though data collection may be the same and the data variables that are collected can be standardized, the accuracy that each automaker has in terms of their in terms of the accuracy of the waveforms that are collected varies significantly. So working to standardize this is incredibly important. Things like internet connectivity, access even to cell phone networks can be challenging in rural settings. So you can't necessarily guarantee that all patients, even if you had them connected to an AACN, if you had them with vehicle telemetry, would have access on the grid to be able to communicate when they needed to. And then lastly, there's a concentration of low tech among vulnerable populations. So if we institute an intervention that really only helps people who have modern vehicles, that doesn't necessarily address the people who we probably need to help the most, which are marginalized groups like we mentioned, or people in rural populations, or the older adults. And then, I think one important limitation that all of us think of is, are there ever risks to AI integration to trauma care? And I think I'll talk about a few. Limited causal inference really may lead to biased outcomes, and I'll use some examples. Patient trust in AI systems does remain limited. And then there's also risk of de-skilling. So this is, I was talking with some people about this dinner yesterday, and that we have to be cautious about what AI interventions and algorithms we introduce. This is a AI algorithm that was introduced into the criminal justice system. Judges have known to sometimes be biased in when they're judging people or sentencing people, I should say, based on whether they're hungry, the time of the day, whether they want to get out of there. And this system was invented actually to try to reduce that bias. It was called Compass, and this was in a ProPublica study that was done in 2016, had demonstrated that this system, which if you committed a crime, it would make a recommendation as to your risk of recommitting a crime. And it took into multiple proprietary inputs. But what they found was that the system had nearly double the false positive rate for African-American offenders as it did for white offenders. And similarly, had much higher false negative rate for white offenders than African-American offenders. So in the two examples we have on this slide, one male who had 2 armed robberies and 1 attempted armed robbery was decided to be a low risk for recidivism, compared to an African-American female who had 4 juvenile misdemeanors and was considered to be high risk. Now, these are kind of stark examples, but this system was not, in healthcare, we think a lot about these things because we think of downstream effects, mostly because of legal ramifications. This system was deployed, and if no one really looked into these things and had studied whether or not that it was applied equitably. Now, the company that makes this algorithm actually says they don't think there's a problem because the algorithm's accuracy is actually pretty high, and it's equivalent accuracy for both groups. And it really goes into the question of what a machine learning model is intended to do. The reality is that it is impossible in any single test if the test doesn't change, you cannot decrease your false positive rate while simultaneously maintaining the same true positive rate. So, and that's just from if you imagine an AUC curve. So the reality is that this model is performing well and that the accuracy is equivalent between each groups. But the trade-off you get is just simply that you have to sacrifice some level of false positivity. And I think an important thing that this also shows that if you are training a algorithm on biased data, you will get a biased result. Machine learning and artificial intelligence are nothing but efficient. So they will take shortcuts to get you to the most accurate representation of the data that you're presenting it with. And lastly, I think you have to think about are we trying to build models for accuracy, or are we trying to build them for ideals? The criminal justice system is based on this idea that you're innocent until proven guilty, and that, at least for criminal cases, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that is the bar that you set for conviction. That term, beyond the shadow of a doubt, implies a very low false positive rate. Yet, if you design a system that does not prioritize low false positive rates, you essentially are going to build a biased system that doesn't do what you want to do. So being accurate may not necessarily be what you want for any machine learning. In terms of concerns about trust, like all clinical research, it does depend on biases of the data, like we discussed. Many AI applications requiring starting to engage to the cloud. Patients are very sensitive about whether they actually want data sent to the cloud. This was a JAMA research letter in which they sent a survey out to patients, and surprisingly, less than 20% of patients actually trusted their healthcare providers to use AI in a way that did not harm them. So there's not a lot of faith that AI is necessarily going to do well. And then there's also a concern for de-skilling. This was a study among colonoscopists in Europe where they introduced a new AI detection system that would help with to detect polyps during colonoscopies. And what they found is in the centers where they introduced the system, they actually found a higher missed polyp rate among people using the tool rather than those who didn't. So whether or not de-skilling is actually a real thing, who knows? But it's something that we have to be aware of, and how humans interact with AI, particularly in critical situations, does need further study. So in summary, artificial intelligence continues to expand everyday life and in trauma care. We're a long way out from automated field triage, but I'm excited to do some of this initial research and do some of these studies. And there are many opportunities to expedite workup and management of traumatic injuries using data generated through daily living. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you everyone for your attention. Happy to answer any questions.
So Ray, congratulations on this work. It's great to see it continue to advance, and Stuart Wang has done a phenomenal job, as you said, building this multidisciplinary team at the University of Michigan. I've had the opportunity to collaborate with him in the past. The American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma is one of our high priorities for injury prevention, is to advance the implementation of AACN systems across the country, particularly for rural areas. You can imagine you're in a crash somewhere and nobody sees it. They don't find you for a long period of time. And we know that rural mortality is much higher as a result. Some of the barriers to that you alluded to, but in Europe, all cars are required to be able to automatically call 911. And here they're not. You have to subscribe to a system, pay money every month to be part of it. And then there's a third-party vendor that calls 911 for you. The car doesn't do it directly. So what are your thoughts about how we can move closer to the European system? And since all the cars are collecting the data, they're required to collect the data. How can we get to the point where that data is transmitted directly to 911 through an algorithm such as what you're talking about in order to defined injury prediction and help us really triage these crashes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Bulger, and thank you so much for all the work you've done because it's been foundational in a lot of the research that I've done. I think I've had the opportunity through the ICAM to meet with a lot of people in automotive companies, and in talking with them, one thing that is fascinating to me is how political American motor vehicles are. If you use the example of electric vehicles, it's fascinating because in the early days of Doge, there was this huge disconnect between spectrums of people on the political agency as to their thoughts on Elon Musk as a person and their thoughts on Elon Musk's company, Tesla. So much of electric vehicles have been perceived around this I don't know, conservative and kind of they're conceived as liberal concepts, which is crazy because it's really just a car, like it's a tool. I don't know what's liberal about a car versus what's conservative about a car, but the reality is that so much that goes into vehicles, so much that goes into what is standardized on motor vehicles, even just so far as to backup cameras and things like that, is actually considered political by people because people politicize their trucks, they politicize their coupes and their sedans. So I think the first thing we can do is try to detach the reality of motor vehicles from a lot of political discourse, because I think that's a huge barrier in terms of making progress in terms of safety. I can tell you, I think most automotive makers would love it if we mandated people had to have AACMs. I think that the marginal cost that it would add probably to your vehicle or your lease would probably be so low that it'd be reasonable and it'd be worthwhile. A lot of that has to be done probably within policy. And I think getting people, what I found is in kind of the amount of policy work that I've touched upon, at least being able to argue things that work on both sides, which are, people's prioritizing safety, prioritizing, minimizing wasted expenses. Those are, I think, arguments that we can get into. I worry, especially if we say, oh, we should be more like Europe, because that always just turns into a politicized argument, which doesn't really get us anywhere. But you're absolutely correct that I think these could be standard and should be.
Dr. Jean, first, I just want to acknowledge you being our visitor from University of Michigan in this exchange program. You're a perfect visitor for us. We welcome you back here, and also really appreciate this reciprocity and partnership with a great sister institution of University of Michigan. I wanted to talk about parts at the beginning and end of your talk, as I was thinking about autonomous vehicles, both in the aspect of will they be safer, which we're predicting that they are. But then I was looking at and that was kind of at the beginning of how do we engineer fewer crashes or safer crashes. And then later looking at data about differences in crashes and response. In your research, are you planning on looking at a comparison of autonomous crashes with non-autonomous crashes? They'd obviously need to be compared adequately because autonomous vehicles are lower speed, urban area, so you'd have to have that comparison. But I'm interested in where you see that aspect going, both in the minimization of crash or crash injury, and then second, how we might compare them in terms of outcomes.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Wood, and thank you incredibly for the opportunity to be here. Autonomous vehicles have always been, I think, since I started this work, been fascinating to me because on the one hand, if you imagine an autonomous vehicle, if every vehicle knew where every other vehicle was in space, there should never be any crashes. It's like bees in a hive. They all know where each other are. They can zip past each other and there shouldn't be problems. I think you really have to break down the autonomous. There's kind of fundamental questions that you have to ask, and then kind of overarching cultural society questions. My personal opinion, which isn't necessarily backed by evidence, but I think we have a higher threshold for machines in terms of mistakes than we do for people. So if an autonomous vehicle cuts the crash fatality rate down by, tenfold, we will still probably question how could a machine do this to us? That Terminator picture doesn't necessarily go away. I think people have a very high sensitivity, and we seem to, part of our shared humanity is that we understand mistakes by people, but we don't understand mistakes by machines. Autonomous vehicles, some of it is baseline on the technology. A lot of there's a lot of data and a lot of studies on simply the infrared cameras that are calibrated are not equally calibrated. So autonomous vehicles have difficulty detecting even darker skin tones than, especially at nighttime. They have difficulty detecting children. So again, these are probably mistakes that humans would have as well. But when these things make headlines and ultimately they impact shareholder value, I think there does become concern. And then, lastly, I think one thing of autonomous vehicles that really prevents us to really making the huge leap is the question of liability. Most automakers, and from talking to them, we've gotten to this kind of, autonomous like 1.0 or 1.5, where some components of the vehicle are automated, where the vehicle will drive, the vehicle will stay in the same lane. It expects you to be awake. It expects you to be paying attention. And if it sees your eyes drifting or sees you sleeping, it will beep to wake you up, and it will pull over because it needs somebody to be watching it. This, you can imagine, this is not fully autonomous in the sense that if I have to sit there awake, staring, watching a vehicle drive, I'd rather just be driving myself because driving is fun. People are probably never going to give up driving. Dr. Walsh and I talked about. So it's the who's at fault and who's liable is something that a lot of automakers are hesitant to get into. So they do require some human component to be awake and interactive and responding, just so at least to some degree that human is ultimately responsible for their own well-being. That is, I think, there have been companies like Waymo, which are in limited cities and they have sufficient investor backing that they really just settle every questionable case out of court. So they haven't gotten into this legal argument. But I think so much of how our society is built really gets in the way of fully autonomous vehicles, certainly. I think we'll continue to see more and more augmented autonomous options that will improve safety. But the last thing we want really is for this to impact people's adoption of new technologies. There's nothing more than auto companies would want than to force everyone or to try to plead with everyone to get updated vehicles or newer vehicles. A, because that's their companies like to sell things, but B, mostly because the safety measures that you have, even from a car that's from 2005 compared to one that's, and I don't think 2005 was that long ago. I feel like I tell myself it was 10 years ago, but compared to 2005 to one that was from, the past 5 years, it's light years away in terms of safety measures. And yet there are some people they cannot get to trade in their vehicles. People who they have recalls on cars and they go to their houses. They ask them to give their vehicle. They offer them a new one and people don't want to give it up. So for them, when they see someone gets in a terrible crash and there are fatalities, it sticks with them because they would love to get everyone to update. I think if we do it the wrong way in terms of pushing autonomous vehicles, we'll probably lose a lot of people along the way.
Thank you so much for coming and for this amazing grand round. I do have a quick question. I know that you also work with first responders. Any bias or any comments about their perception of an event that's triggered by a human that calls 911 versus an automatic event? Any delay in response that you think that have to do with who is reporting?
Yeah, no, excellent question. So currently, at least, we're in the phase where there's always a human at some point. So if there is the OnStar is the example that I see the most of. If there's a crash, OnStar contacts the AACN contacts emergency services. They are speaking with a human. That person says they're concerned about a high risk injury. I think first responders are, if anything, very, very enthusiastic about doing everything they can to save patients and to improve care. So they're really excited about the opportunities to get out there and help someone who they think is at risk. I think a concern they have is, at least from a lot of the literature and from talking to them, is they're always afraid of missing something. So, in deciding how am I going to get this person safely to the trauma center, do I need to stay in the field and try to stabilize them here versus just transport them and get them moving? These are things that they struggle with. So my sense is that they have a lot of enthusiasm for anything that helps them understand the severity and acuity that someone has. I think in terms of kind of emergency responders and like 911 operators or things like that, really just anything that centralizes data, at least from my conversations with them, is useful and appreciated. So things that can tell you exactly how fast they're going, where they are, and can get people to get the resources that are necessary more quickly. There is enthusiasm. So I think there's enthusiasm on their part for it, as long as it actually works, which is hopefully our goal.